So as you all know, NZC has been reading Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, one of Yossi's books for our book club this month. It's been really inspiring to hear so many young people discuss the themes, arguments, and the framework of the book at such a deep level. And if you'd like to be updated on all things NZC, such as our upcoming book clubs, our future programming like this, and other weekly discussions, please follow us on Twitter at New Zionists and Instagram at New Zionist Congress. And also, please do sign up to become an official member of our organization. It's free at newzionists.org. That's newzionists.org. As you know, NZC is a rapidly expanding group of young Jews committed to Zionist education and empowerment. Please support our work and tell your friends to follow us too. I enjoy our work. Yossi enjoys our work. We're very lucky. I hope you will enjoy it as well. So now I'm very excited to introduce our guest, Yossi. Yossi Klein Halevi is Senior Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Together with Imam Abdullah Antepli of Duke University, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Yossi's 2013 book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year award, and his latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, was a New York Times bestseller. He writes for leading op-ed pages in the US, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and is also a former contributing editor to New Republic. Yossi, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Oh, really a pleasure. And Josh, I actually want to thank all of you, first of all, for the courage and the commitment, to be declaring yourself Zionist on campuses these days really is an act of great courage. And we've got a lot riding, the Jewish people has a lot riding on all of you and everything that you're doing for the rest of us. So that's my first thank you. My second thank you is more personal, and that's as a writer, for you all to be reading and discussing a book that I've written is a great gift. It's a great gift to an author. It's the ultimate gift to an author, really, to take what you write seriously. And so I'm very grateful for that as well. I'm delighted to be with you guys. So.
Thank you. Yes, that really does mean a lot for all of us to hear. So just a little quick intro for how today's going to go, or tonight, this morning, this evening, wherever you may be in the world. So it's going to be about a 60-minute talk first between me and Yossi, and after that, we'll have about 30 minutes where you can ask your questions. So for anyone who hasn't been on a Zoom webinar before, we have a Q&A chat. Please feel free at any point in the chat to send your questions in there. We obviously can't promise that we'll be able to get to all questions. However, we really do appreciate your input, and we really look forward to getting to your questions towards the second end of the chat. So I guess with that, let's get started. Yossi, before we get into the tachlis, how are you? How's Israel going right now? I see I made sure to check the news as I woke up for this. I said that for the first time since May, they have 100 serious cases of COVID. It seems like it's a bit of an interesting period right now.
Yeah, I think that we're all getting used to the fact that COVID in one form or another is going to be a part of our lives. I do think that there's a pretty strong Israeli sense of confidence that we're going to be able to live with and around this thing, that it's not going to completely stop our lives the way that it did for large parts of the last year and a half. I think the most exciting thing that's happening in Israel right now for me and I think for many of us is this new government, this crazy, extraordinary new government that every day that it manages to survive is an occasion to celebrate. And I think that they're going to make some really important changes especially in Arab-Israeli, Jewish-Israeli relations, and also in terms of religious, the control of religious affairs by the ultra-Orthodox. I think that's very much on the agenda of this government. And of course, replacing Netanyahu and the worst government that this country ever had, the most corrupt, the most divisive, the most immoral, and so for all those reasons, I have a great sense of gratitude for this moment, however long it lasts. I feel it's already a victory for Israel.
Now, I don't know if people are going to believe us, but we didn't rehearse that because my first question is about the new coalition. Yossi, you wrote a piece in the Times of Israel in mid-June as the new government was sworn in, essentially talking about why it gives you hope. So it hasn't been very long, not even 2 months since you wrote that piece. But how do you think they are going so far? And what do you think we should be expecting from them in the next few months?
So let's look at a few areas. Arab-Israeli, the first measure of this government's success is going to be whether it succeeds in fulfilling its promise to seriously reduce violent crime in the Arab sector. This has been a key demand of the Arab community for the last years, and the government in the past paid lip service to promising to fight violent crime in the Arab communities, but really doing very little. Now there's talk of actively recruiting several thousand Arab police. There's going to be a major infusion of funding going into anti-crime efforts in the Arab community. I think, by the way, that one of the sources, it's not the only reason, but one of the sources of the violence that we experienced 2 months ago between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis was our failure by the failure of the Jewish majority to deal with criminal elements, violent criminal elements in the Arab communities, and it came back to haunt us, because you can't confine crime to one community. Eventually, it's going to spill over, and it may take all kinds of other colorations. It may take on political or religious nature as well. And I think that this government will be judged by the Arab community, first of all, by its ability to make good on its promise to controlling crime. Another crucial area is what I briefly referred to earlier, and that is the ultra-Orthodox control over Israel's religious life, Jewish religious life. Now, this government is not going to bring religious pluralism. It's not going to recognize Reform and conservative Judaism, although I do believe that the tone is going to change. The tone is going to shift from contempt, which is what we experienced with the ultra-Orthodox in power, to respect for the non-Orthodox liberal denominations. And that in itself is already a crucial shift. But the practical changes in the relationship between religion and state, I would say, are going to be more in the nature of shifting control of the religious state apparatus from ultra-Orthodox hands back into more moderate religious Zionist hands. And when I speak of religious Zionists as moderates, I mean religiously moderate. I'm not speaking now about their political position. Most of the religious Zionist community is quite hardline on settlements. But on religious issues, a majority of the religious Zionist community sees itself very much as connected to the Israeli mainstream, and has moderate instincts, as we see with Bennett, and so there are going to be, I think, important correctives to the growing ultra-Orthodox domination of conversion in Israel, of kashrut supervising kosher products. The ultra-Orthodox have really abused their power and turned it into a monopoly. And the Likud allowed that to happen, especially Netanyahu. And that's going to change. Hopefully, the government will have enough of a longevity to allow these changes to take root. I think that the one change that this government has already brought in is to create an alternative model to what we've been experiencing over the last years. Netanyahu, I would define the sin of Netanyahu against Israeliness in three areas. One is he tried to encourage our internal schisms, turn Israeli against Israeli, Arab Israeli against Jewish Israeli, left-wing Israeli Jews against right-wing Israeli Jews. He turned against the Israeli democratic ethos. He undermined the legitimacy of key democratic institutions, especially the courts, the police, for his, obviously because of his own legal problems. And finally, Netanyahu corrupted our foreign policy, the basic moral backbone of Israeli foreign policy, by realigning Israel with some of the world's worst dictators. And so this government is already creating changes in all three of those areas. And if it succeeds in doing nothing else but offering the Israeli public an alternative vision to what governance could look like in the state of Israel, then I think it really will have achieved a remarkable accomplishment.
And I think after having 12 years in charge, I think you're right, even if it's just something different, because sometimes people need to change. And it did seem like the Israeli people saying, we're ready for a change.
Well, many of us were saying it. Unfortunate, and yes, and a majority. There is a slight majority, I think, that was for change. I hope that slight majority will grow as people see what proper governance can look like.
I guess we'll have to wait and see. You never know with Israel or any government. Your first point, you said that what the government's first and foremost going to be judging is whether or not they can combat crime in the Arab sector. And I want to touch on Ram, because obviously they play a big role in that. Now, on the face of it, for a lot of Israelis, for a lot of Jews who are observing from the outside, the idea of having an Islamist party in the Israeli governing coalition is a bit odd on face value. But on the other hand, Israelis are actually widely viewing this as a very promising sign of things to come when you talk about integration of acceptance of Israeli Arabs into society, because we know that although they have full legal rights, they have suffered a lot of marginalization over the years. So it's a bit of a two-pronged question. So on one hand, how legitimate do you think the concerns are that some people are spouting about having an Islamist party in the coalition? But more importantly, what changes do you see Ram bringing into Israel, whether it's with Jewish-Arab relations, into the Israeli Arab community?
Look, Josh, it's so counterintuitive that the breakthrough in Arab-Jewish joint governance would actually happen through an Islamist party, that it's really an Israeli moment. It's so crazy. It's so out of the box that it makes perfect sense in an Israeli context. It's interesting because there was a poll taken about a week ago the public's attitudes toward different aspects of this government. And in every measure of judging the success of this government, a majority approved of what the government was doing, where it was trying to go, except in one area, and that is the alliance with Ra'am. A majority of Israelis do not support that. Now, I understand the nervousness of Jewish Israelis toward bringing in an Islamist party, a party whose founding platform defines Zionism as racism. Bringing in a party that has been close to Erdogan all these years. There are, this is an open question of how this is going to go. I think that Ra'am's leader, Abbas, is very much in a process of political evolution. And it's very moving to see him going from hesitancy to more self-confidence. There are legitimate questions about how the rest of his party is relating to this process, how deeply they're being changed, and finally, how much we, the Jewish majority, are being changed by this process. The transformation has to be mutual. Both sides really need to go through a process of recognition that neither side is going to emerge from this experiment in exactly the same place as we were before it began. Now, what that means, really, who knows? But we're in a very dynamic moment. And bear in mind, again, that what makes this, I think, so significant is that it comes after the worst Arab-Jewish violence, street violence, that this country has experienced since 1948. And to move from the lowest point in Arab-Jewish relations to an unprecedented breakthrough where we have a joint Arab-Jewish governing coalition, that's the Israeli roller coaster. It's so unpredictable. And one of the things that I learned very early on after moving to Israel was never try to define Israel by a particular moment or through a particular lens, because Israel is so dynamic, it's so fluid that that you really need to be open to the next surprise, because the only thing we can know for certain here is that there's going to be another major surprise coming down the road, probably not not too far into the future, whether it's domestic, whether it's on the borders. There's always some major surprise waiting for us.
And I think that that's what keeps Israeli politics so interesting. At least I'm saying that from Australia, where not much goes on, in all honesty. And I think, talking about, intra-community relations, Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, Arabs, I think it's quite a good segue to move to your book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. Now, one of the themes that was common throughout it is, we stand very strong by our own story as Jews, as Zionists, but despite that, we still really seek to empathize and to understand the Palestinian narrative. And now your book, New York Times bestseller, is obviously loved by so many people, yet it seems that despite people really buying into this idea, buying into the book, it seems that it's so rare that you're going to find someone today who really, really does seek to understand the Palestinian side, whether that's in Israel, whether that's in Jewish communities around the world. So I could be wrong, but that's at least my take on it. So why do you think that's the case? Why do you think there's such a hesitancy, despite people really engaging with your book, engaging with your work, saying this is amazing, yet they're not quite ready to take that actual step themselves? And what do you think we can do about it?
Look, Josh, I think that you're right from the perspective of Israeli Jewish society and of most of the diaspora, with the very major exception of American Jewry. Most of the diaspora outside of the United States, I think more or less is aligned emotionally with where most Israelis are at. It's certainly true for the Australian Jewish community. It's true for the Canadian Jewish community, South Africa. I don't know the South American Jewish communities, but I suspect it's probably similar there as well. Okay, here's Isaac, a Panamanian Jew. So when we speak about, one of the things that I've learned is never speak about the Israeli diaspora crisis, because it's not an Israeli diaspora crisis. It's an Israeli American Jewish crisis. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that 90% of the diaspora is the United States. So we're really speaking about a major threat to the Jewish people, to Jewish unity, and it really comes on this. My frustration with many of my fellow Israeli Jews is that they're not willing to stretch themselves and ask themselves the question, what's going on the next hill? And I'm pointing literally on the next hill because there are I'm looking at the lights of two Palestinian villages on the next hill. And many Israelis live in that intimacy. And we've, as a society, we stopped asking ourselves what's happening over there, what is it like for our Palestinian neighbors? And I understand why. I also went through the second Intifada here. I went through years of rage at Palestinians, and I'm not a fan of the Palestinian national movement. I am very far from being an admirer of the Palestinian national movement in any of its factions. But I feel this frustration among my fellow Israeli Jews who have even stopped asking the question, what's our vision of the future? What do we think is going to happen here 50 years from now if nothing changes? Are we going to annex? Are we going to remain Jewish and democratic? Which part of this is going to go? The Jewish, the democratic? We've stopped having that conversation. At the same time, and so I want more empathy toward Palestinians. I want Israeli Jews to be listening more. I want us to be more engaged with Palestinians without buying into the Palestinian narrative, because I don't, and I don't expect or want Israeli Jews to buy into the Palestinian narrative. But I think we need to pay attention to it. My frustration with growing numbers of American Jews is the opposite, that too many are buying into the Palestinian narrative indiscriminately, are in fact exchanging the Jewish Zionist narrative for the Palestinian narrative. The way in which we need to engage, the place from which we need to engage the Palestinians, and I believe deeply in engagement, but I believe even more deeply than engagement, I believe in affirming the truth and integrity of our story. It's from that place that we can reach out. And if you're not firmly planted in your own story, then empathy for your neighbor's story is going to be hollow. In the same way that we know that universalism that's not grounded in particularism is either sentimental or abstract. you learn to love humanity by loving that part of humanity that is closest to you, with all of its faults, and that's the Jewish people. And so the Jewish people for me has really been, I would say, my training ground for learning to love more abstractly, learning to love larger and larger groups, and that's humanity. In the same way, if I'm going to reach out to the Palestinian narrative and try to understand the Palestinian narrative, I had better do so from a place of deep love for the Jewish story. And that, for me, is a prerequisite.
And I think I can really personally resonate with that idea of, really standing strong by our story. I mean, I wrote a piece in the Forward a couple of months ago, which you actually helped me out with. So thank you for that. About the Jerusalem Day flag parade and why I was opposed to, it going through East Jerusalem. And I got a message from someone.
Josh. It was a great piece.
Thank you.
It was really an important piece to have that voice coming from the religious Zionist community. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, thank you. And I really do appreciate to hear that. And I got a message from a friend, and they said that it was this, this piece was kind of a new brand of apologetic Zionism, what they called it. And I explained to them, well, I'm not trying to apologize for anything. It's simply, Yossi, as you explained, I'm owning my story, but I just, I'm trying to act with decency towards the other side. And I think once we can, if we can really shape towards that, we don't need to apologize for anything. And I think often, especially in certain places in American Jewish communities, we're seeing that, where there's a confusion between acting decent towards the other side and, actually apologizing for our Zionism. And I want to, I guess,
Josh, sometimes I think of the Israeli-American Jewish relationship as a problem of anatomy. That in Israel, we need to open our hearts more. And in America, Jews need to firm up their spine a little bit more. And so it's sometimes I wish we could almost have a little bit of a transfusion, or a transplant, where we can put something of the Israeli spine in parts of the American Jewish community, and something of the American Jewish heart here. And I think we'd be a more holistic people if we listen to the concerns of the other,
Exactly. And I think, I'm sure you're well aware, Daniel Gordis has, spent a lot of time in recent years talking about the divide between American Jews and Israel. And one thing in particular that he explains, or at least attempts to paint out, which I think is really brilliant, is that, a lot of people talk about a crisis right now. Okay, American Jews are breaking away from Israel, et cetera, but Gordis kind of steps back and he says, hold up, this crisis has been going on, even before the state of Israel existed, between Zionist leaders, Ben Gurion, Klein, and American Jews. So I want to ask you, if you accept that stance, that it's been going on for almost a century now, what can we really do to improve it? I was listening to a chat that you had. It was with Brett Stevens. I don't remember who was running the interview. It was on YouTube from a couple of years ago. And you said that growing up in America in the 1980s, you grew up in a community of American Jews that loved Israel, but really didn't know much about it. So given that it doesn't seem to be like it's this American Jews are suddenly realizing that they're not fans of Israel, it really seems to be just this continuation of this lack of understanding between both sides. So what can we do, or what can the two communities actually do to improve the relationship, or to fix it, to save it from dying?
I actually grew up in the American Jewish community of the 60s and 70s. By 1982, I was already in Israel. So in terms of the question, and I think that's really one of the seminal questions for this generation. To some extent, I agree that there will be built-in dissonance, misunderstandings. We live in very different geographical circumstances. Israelis live in a region that by and large has not accepted us. American Jews live in the most accepting diaspora that Jews have ever known, even with the growing rise of anti-Semitism. And I certainly am aware of the dangers that this moment poses to American Jews. But those misunderstandings are built in. I would say that what we need to start really working on is a basic sense of appreciation that each community, and again, you know, the rest of diaspora, Australia, Panama, forgive me, I'm really going to be focusing on Israel and American Jewry here. I think that we need to appreciate the fact that each major center of Jewish life is responding in a way that is appropriate to its circumstances. And so for Israelis living in one of the most dangerous and volatile regions on the planet, being a minority state in a Muslim and Arab region, means that we need to be tough. We need to relate to our environment from a place of deterrence. We need to deter hostility. American Jewry needs to relate to its environment in exactly the opposite way, by reciprocating the embrace. You know, the polls have shown that American Jews are the most popular minority in the country. And we see it in the intermarriage statistics. And so American Jews have responded by being flexible to their environment, by being open, receptive, in exactly the opposite ways in which Israelis have had to respond to our environment. So the most important premise is each side needs to respect the wisdom of each community's response to its particular circumstances. We responded in the only way that made sense for Israel, which is to be the toughest kid on the block. And American Jews responded in the only way that made sense, to be a Jew in the most accepting, open diaspora that Jews have ever lived in. And so the starting point needs to be mutual acceptance and mutual respect of these fundamental differences. Beyond that, I think we need to have much more of a curiosity about the kinds of Jewish lives that each community has been developing. It drives me crazy that diaspora Jews don't know Israeli music. Because I think Israeli music is the great cultural creation of Zionism. And that's music that doesn't just belong to Israelis. That's music that belongs to the Jewish people. It drives me crazy that Israeli Jews know nothing about Reform and conservative Judaism. They think they know. They have these caricatures that they hear from Haredi politicians about dogs being given bark mitzvahs. And it might have happened, you know, there might have been some Reform rabbi somewhere who did a bark mitzvah, but that is kind of in the mind of many Israelis. You mentioned Reform Judaism. Oh, they give bar mitzvahs to dogs. You know, it's this fundamental lack of respect. And that's what has to change in the relationship.
And there really is there really is so much work that needs to be done. I know I'm talking on religion, I guess, also from the American side. You know, we see one of the great causes of stress for American Jews is the total lack of respect that the Israeli rabbinate, and then for American Jews, it seems to be that Israeli society on a whole, you know, pays to non-Orthodox streams of Judaism. And I think what's so interesting about it is, you know, when Bibi walked back on the agreement a couple of years ago for there to be an egalitarian press space at the Kotel, and American Jews were rightly outraged. But again, what seemed to be a bit of a disconnect is what they didn't actually realize is that for a lot of Israelis, it wasn't actually an issue. You know, if you're not a religious Israeli, you're not going to go to the Kotel. And there aren't that many, you know, reform and conservative non-Orthodox denominations in Israel. So Israelis didn't really see what, you know, the whole brouhaha was about. You know, while American Jews saw this, you know, as a massive affront to their identity and to their being. As American Jews, you know, where's my place in Israel? There is so much work to be done. And I know that this isn't the only conversation being had about it, which is a good thing. But back to your book for a second, your letters book. I want to actually push back on the premise a tiny bit if I can. When you introduce the responses from Palestinians and Arabs, you gave kind of a bit of a preface that these are the responses that I'm showing you guys, but I don't actually know how widespread these sentiments are in the Palestinian world or in the Muslim world. Now, to kind of give a bit of an anecdote as to where I'm coming from, I was in Ramallah a couple of years ago with another Jewish friend. Obviously, you know, we took off any sort of signs that we were Jewish, tzitzit, kippot, any sort of Jewish text on us. We left back in an apartment in Jerusalem, and I decided that I wanted to get a haircut. And so we're sitting in there, there's just a couple of other guys in there, obviously all Palestinian. And we've been sitting there for about 5 minutes, barely any of them spoke English or good English. And all of a sudden, one of them blurts out these 4 words, which I'll never, ever forget. Do you hate Jews? Thankfully, my friend was very quick on his feet and said, we don't care. And that was the end of that. But what stuck with me ever since was it just total openness and how nonchalant they are about the fact, oh yeah, you know, it's totally okay to say in Palestinian society, yeah, I hate Jews, which, you know, you would not see in so many, especially wouldn't expect it in a Western place, not in America, not in Australia, you know, sitting in a barber in New York, you're not going to hear someone say, don't you hate the Chinese in front of everyone else. So with this sentiment that obviously Palestinians aren't all anti-Semitic, but just at least appreciating how widespread anti-Semitism is in Palestinian society, I want to kind of challenge your book and say, you know, what if this reaching out to Palestinians, what if this reaching out to the wider Muslim world could it possibly all be in vain?
You know, it's a question that I deliberately don't allow myself to ask myself. And the reason for that is that, first of all, when I wrote this book, I had very modest goals. And my goal was to find a few Palestinians. I didn't, you know, I don't know, half a dozen, a dozen. I just wanted a few people with whom I could partner a different kind of Palestinian-Israeli conversation. A conversation in which we respectfully disagree about almost everything, but agree about 2 crucial points. The first point is that there are 2 indigenous peoples in this land. And the second point is that both peoples deserve to have national self-determination. And it wasn't enough for me to find Palestinian partners who would say, yes, we're for a 2-state solution, because that doesn't necessarily translate into acceptance of the indigenousness of the Jewish people. Because some Palestinians will say, well, we can't destroy the Jews now. And so, you know, we accept a 2-state solution for now. I wanted to find Palestinian partners who were as committed to a 2-state solution from a place of justice as Israelis who support a 2-state solution are. When Israelis support a 2-state solution, that's a commitment, that's a moral commitment. I wanted Palestinians who support a two-state solution, not just because they can't destroy Israel, but because they have that moral commitment. And Josh, I'm just going to write that note down because it's something I haven't thought about before, and I want to be sure not to lose the point. So because I'm writing something about this.
Is that a new book that you're working on?
Yes.
Yes. That's very exciting. I'll be sure to buy it when it comes out. Everyone else take the memo.
So thank you for indulging me. But okay, so okay, so all I was I'm not a politician. I'm not a diplomat. I'm a writer. I'm not going to make peace. All I can do is work with language and try to use that language to help facilitate a new kind of conversation. And if I would be able in that process to actually find a few Palestinian partners, Diana, I couldn't hope for more than that. And I did find my partners. So I would say that I fulfilled what modest goals I set out to reach. And beyond that, there's no frustration, there's no thwarted expectations because I didn't have any. I'll tell you something, this isn't something that I've spoken a lot about publicly, but it took me 2 years to find a publisher for this book. Every publisher in New York turned the book down. And I gave up on it. And then at the last moment, a young Jewish editor, 27 years old, at HarperCollins, sent me an email. I didn't even know that she had the manuscript. I really was just ready to give up. And she sent me an email saying somebody passed this on to her. And she said, this book speaks to me as a young American Jew who has been increasingly alienated from Israel, and I would like to publish it. So that's how the book got published. So going from the place of not even being able to find a publisher to seeing the book really taking root in parts of the public conversation and finding Palestinian partners with whom to model this complicated conversation that I was looking for partners for. That's pretty, for me, that's pretty amazing. So.
Well, thank you to that 27-year-old editor who went against the grain. No, I mean, it's so important to have this different conversation, because even amongst the most nuanced and the most complex and the most well-informed Jews and Zionists among us, it still seems to be that when we get to the conversation of what can we do about the conflict, it seems to still be the same old: the Palestinians need to stop incitement, the Palestinians need to clamp down on terrorism. And although it's true, we've been saying the same thing for the last 7 decades. So maybe we do need more people like you, just bringing a different conversation. There's a different way to think about it, and who knows where that's going to lead us.
One of the things. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No. Go.
One of the things I've been thinking about as a result of having published this book and meeting Palestinians and being deeply engaged in this conversation is realizing that in a sense the conflict, it's clarified for me what this conflict is about and why it's so hard to solve. What this conflict is about is a very simple question, and that is, who started? And the answer to who started depends on where you start counting from. Where do you start the story from? Ask a Palestinian or most Arabs who started this conflict, and the answer is, well, obviously the Jews started. We were minding our own business, living our lives, and suddenly you show up and you make this crazy claim that you were here 2,000 years ago and it's your land, and nobody ever heard of such a strange claim before, and no people ever did it. And that's true, by the way. We have a pretty strange story, but the Jewish story was always strange. And this, in some ways, is the culminating strangeness of the Jewish story. The fact that we actually returned. It's a pretty strange turn in our story. And
it's certainly.
And so the first. So if you ask Arabs who started it, we started it. We showed up. We brought the conflict with us, or as one of my friends, one of my Palestinian friends will put it, you Jews imported the conflict to us. And that's, from their perspective, I get that. From our perspective, ask us who started, and the answer is obvious. You, the Arab world and the Palestinian national movement, you started this conflict. We came home. All we did was fulfill what was the essence of our identity. All of Jewish history was pointing in this direction. And really almost from the moment that we began coming home, we offered you, the Palestinians, a fair compromise. At any point in this conflict, you could have had a state going back to 1937, 1947, 2000, 2008, et cetera. And then it really stopped once Netanyahu came into power. There is no et cetera after 2008, but actually, we tried, we offered a fair deal, and you rejected every compromise. And not only did you reject every compromise, but you tried to destroy us. And not only did you try to destroy us, but 3 years after the Holocaust, you tried to destroy the state of Israel, which was the hope of the Jewish people recovering from the Holocaust. And then the Arab world effectively expels nearly 1 million Jews from diasporas that in most cases predate Islam. And so we're pretty angry too. You're not the only ones who are angry. And so that's the question in terms of who started this conflict. There's another question. How do we start solving the conflict? Ask Palestinians, and they'll say something very simple. You Israelis, take your boot off of our neck, stop occupying us, stop controlling us, and then we'll talk about normalization. Ask Israelis what the next step should be. And what we'll say is, do you think we're total morons? Do you really think that we're going to go back to borders that are 8 miles wide at their narrowest point in the Middle East, which is burning all around us? Do you really think we're going to risk trusting the Palestinian national movement by creating a Palestinian state here, literally a few hundred meters from where I'm sitting, and risk that turning into another Gaza without you first showing some goodwill and normalization? You think we're just going to give you the state? Would you do that in our place? And so the question then is, which side is going to start? Who's going to make the first overture? What I did in my book was, in a way, try to model a strategy for circumventing that deadlock. I reached out to the Palestinians. I said, this is my story. I'm inviting you to read this book. Read it, free download in Arabic. Here's my website. Respond to me. And I will publish your responses. And when the second edition came out, which I hope is the edition that you all read, which was the paperback edition, not only did I include Palestinian responses, but I gave the Palestinian counter narrative the last word. And that was a way of really trying to show respect and goodwill. And so, in a way, I think that is for me a way of trying to circumvent this deadlock. I need to know that there are some Palestinians who are willing to listen to my story, who are not just going to write me off as the final wave of European colonialism, but that I have an actual story that should be listened to. You don't have to agree. I'm not expecting Palestinians to rejoice at the fact that I've come home, but I want you to understand what it means to me that I came home. And then I want to listen to what my coming home has meant to you, because that's part of the story. I can't avoid that. But that's the reciprocity. And maybe that's a way of circumventing this deadlock.
And I think one thing that really, I think, keeps that deadlock in place is, I think, one, pride. Who's going to swallow their pride and listen? But I think also pain, because I think whatever way you put it, I know for me, it was exceptionally uncomfortable to read some of the Palestinian responses to your book, irrelevant of how important they were to read. Some of them were just very uncomfortable. But we need to engage with that, and we need to understand that, because after all, as you said, you can literally see them out of your window on the other hill. Now, on a very different topic, we spoke very briefly about it before we started recording, about the rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and just animosity towards Israel in America. You said, obviously, you apologized earlier that we're largely talking about American Jews. I'm an Australian and I'm talking about American Jews. So I think we can all agree that this is a very big issue for world Jewry. You said that in terms of young Jewish reactions, or just Jewish reactions in America in general, there are going to be three different responses to what's going on. I was wondering if you could maybe just kind of give a bit of a backdrop as to what is going on, and then also just to talk about those three different responses that you see happening.
So I think that young American Jews are really at a crossroads. And the whole American Jewish community, I think, is at a crossroads, because what the mainstreaming of anti-Zionism in progressive spaces is doing, and this is happening much quicker than many of us expected. What this is doing is restoring what I would call conditional acceptance of Jews in American life. And the great achievement of American Jewry in the post-Holocaust era was really to win unconditional acceptance. You could be as Jewish, as un-Jewish as you want, and America would accept you. You could be Chabad, you can light the Chanukiah in a public space, you can assimilate. It doesn't matter. America allowed you to be Jewish in whatever way you wanted. What is changing in progressive spaces is that you must be a Jew in a certain kind of way now. Your acceptance in progressive spaces depends on your renouncing your identification with Israel and Zionism. Now, this is a throwback to pre-World War II era American Jewish experience, and I don't think that many American Jews have fully internalized it yet. I think that you guys have, whether you've given it a name, this name of the return of conditionality to the American Jewish experience, whether you've named it consciously or not. I think that intuitively you guys understand that we're at a turning point. And I think you also understand that BDS and everything that that represents is ultimately much greater a threat to diaspora Jews than it is to the state of Israel. State of Israel is going to survive BDS. The Israeli economy is not going to be significantly hurt whether Ben & Jerry's sells in the settlements or not. But the atmosphere that's being created on campuses by Ben & Jerry's not selling in parts of Israel, and by knowing that the directorate of Ben & Jerry's wanted to pull out of Israel altogether, the impact is going to be much greater on American Jews than it is going to be on Israel. So the question then is to answer your question, how will young Jews respond? I think we're going to see, we already are seeing three basic responses. The first understandable majority response is to just kind of be quiet. Keep your head down, just let this pass. I'm not going to take up this fight. I'm in college to get a degree. I'm in college to have fun. I'm not in college to fight Israel's battles, to make peace in the Middle East. I'm not going to fight for the Palestinians. I'm not going to fight for Israel. I'm just going to keep, I just want it to be a normal college experience. That's probably the majority, maybe even a large majority. A small but growing minority is going to internalize the what I would call the devil's bargain that the progressive anti-Zionists are offering young Jews, which is we will accept you provided that you betray your people. And we're seeing more young Jews accepting that deal. And the third group, which are you guys, are those who are fighting back, those who understand that this is a seminal moment in Jewish history, that this is a war for the legitimacy of the Jewish story, that it's the Jewish story which is under assault. And we are our story. That's who we are as a people. And you guys are on the front lines. You are going to be taking the heat, and that's just going to get, unfortunately, more and more intense in the coming months and years. The good news here, I think, is that we're going to see more and more young Jews saying that they've had enough and joining you guys. And that's why I really believe that the structures, the organizational structures that are being created now, whether it's the Zionist Congress, whether it's Zionists or a wider bridge, those groups that are fighting in progressive spaces as Zionists, I think that you are really the avant-garde, and I don't believe that you're going to be alone. And one of the reasons for that, the bad news, is that our enemies are going to be more and more emboldened, are going to be more and more outrageous and offensive in their assault on our story. And I think that we will be surprised, pleasantly surprised, by those young Jews who may have preferred to be silent until now, who at some point are going to say, that's it, I can't sit this thing out anymore. I have to take a stand.
Thank you for that. And it's definitely an issue that's going to be chasing us for the next while. I think on that note, I did tell the audience that we were going to have time for questions, but I do understand, Yossi, that you have to go. So on that note, Yossi, we really can't thank you enough for taking the time to speak to us. To everyone who's joined, we hope you enjoyed. We will be uploading this to YouTube, so you can definitely share it around to anybody who wasn't able to make it. Again, if you want to follow New Zionists on Twitter, we are New Zionists, Zionists plural, Instagram New Zionist Congress, and please do sign up to our newsletter, newzionistsplural.org. Yossi, thank you again, everybody. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you all. And really, it's a privilege to be with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. And we hope to see you all next time. Bye, everyone.